I'm going to be chairing the first session, which is a session entitled The Birth of Foucault and the Abnormal. Unfortunately, Stephanie Jenkins, who was scheduled to present in the session, is unable to be with us today. So I'm going to present in Stephanie's stead. I will present some, I will present excerpt of one of my forthcoming publications. But first we have, so I'm going to speak last, where Stephanie would have spoken second. I'm going to speak last in the session, since all of the sessions are following alphabetical order in terms of presentations. So this session is meant to commemorate the centennial of Foucault's birth. Many of us regard Foucault as absolutely essential for philosophical analyses of disability. And I've actually written a paper that I will link to in the chat, in which I argue that Foucault is what is, for all intents and purposes, the first philosopher of disability. So I will link to that in the chat. So we wanted to have a session at the conference that would commemorate Foucault and his importance for work on disability to many of us. So the first presenter in the session is Will Conway. Will is a PhD student in philosophy at Stony Brook University, whose investigations focus on eugenic modernity, Foucault, biopolitics, and the apparatus of disability. Most of Will's work can be found at revoltingbodies.com, a blog on which he's written since 2020. I've had the distinct pleasure of interviewing Will for Dialogues on Disability in January 2021, and more recently in November 2025. You can find a link to the latter interview in the chat, as I mentioned. So Will is going to speak for 25 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. So Will, turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm going to give a brief description. I'm a white guy with brown hair in a sort of like loft office thing that is somewhat a mess, with like objects strewn about, a cabinet or bookshelf that's probably going to fall, hopefully not during this presentation. And there is a copy of Security, Territory, and Population by Michel Foucault right behind me. So with that out of the way, I'll just get started. For the past 2 years, my focus has been investigating what my friends and I have described as eugenic modernity. I have examined this first from the position of neoliberalism and biopolitics, which I presented here, then from the state of exception and the political decision. Now I would like to extend this analysis to something more general, to the democratic principles operating within contemporary bourgeois democracies. However, I want to focus on a thinker whose specter, alongside those of Hobbes, Spinoza, and others like Pufendorf and Suarez and so on, hangs over us, and that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's entire philosophical project, and I mean this without a hint of overstatement, is representative of the fundamental transformations that took place during the advent of what we could call bourgeois democracies. In a lecture given in Brazil in 1976 called The Mesh of Power, Foucault laments that the Rousseauification of Marx by revolutionaries in the 19th century and his own has caused a solidification and stultifying of analysis. I will extend Foucault's critique that alongside Hobbes, Marcuse, and Freud, one of Foucault's primary targets in the history of sexuality is, in fact, Rousseau. And to be more blunt, the democratic tradition that heralds the social contract. Foucault shows us that recourse to democratic principles in the face of our eugenic condition actually strengthens that condition. It will take an evacuation of those claims of legitimacy to understand exactly where we are and how we got here. We can and should extend this criticism and reveal that Rousseau's political ontology is explicitly one of social defense and what I will call here biopolitical absolutism, and that those clinging to the principles are clinging to the predicates of eugenic modernity. Rousseau trades absolute monarchism for a biopolitical absolutism that makes the function of the state explicitly aligned with what Shelley Tremain has called the government of disability. The emergence of constitutions and social right correlates exactly with the vitalization of massacres that Foucault speaks of in the fifth part of the History of Sexuality and his lecture series, Society Must Be Defended. So we'll do this in sort of 3 schematic steps, and I apologize for it being rather schematic. First, what will be examined is how Rousseau lays out his political ontology, how he transfers sovereignty to the social body through the general will, and how this lines up line by line with the biopolitical transformation that Foucault articulates in part 5 of the first volume of the History of Sexuality. Ultimately, what Rousseau is searching for is a naturalized basis for the legitimacy of power. Second, once one has grasped the constituent parts of Rousseau's biopolitical ontology, the function of the sovereign itself must now be examined. First, the basis of the right to punish is laid out explicitly in biopolitical terms, and then a step-by-step analysis will be necessary. And the hailed essay on the origins of inequality actually reveals to us just how much biopolitics plays a role in Rousseau's political economy and political philosophy. And finally, if time permits, I'd like to address why, before Foucault ends his 1976 lecture series, Society Must Be Defended, with the introduction of biopolitics, he spends 2 whole lectures discussing the emergence of the notion of constituent power and the bourgeois concept of the Constitution. I believe this analysis of the forces that compose the social body, their leveraging and their protection, these are what the so-called radical Democrats constantly call on to overturn our age, but in fact are the very things that serve as its condition. So first, let's talk about Rousseau's biopolitical ontology. Rousseau's general will, or volonté générale, is a largely misunderstood notion. It's often reduced to the will of all, and that's not what it is. The general will is a force that is always right and aligns with utilité publique. What is at stake and what is in the interest of public utility is precisely what is at stake in the general will. The will of all can be erroneous. The general will can never err, because the maximization of utility is always directed towards progress. This is, of course, the basis of the first principle of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is often translated as social distinctions can only be based on common good, but in fact, the architects of the Declaration of the Rights of Man after the French Revolution, in fact, write the foundation can only be based in public utility, l'utilité commune. Inequality always has to track with a common utility. The general will, however, is inexpressible without a sovereign, which is equally inalienable. Rousseau's system, which still informs how we conceive of political activity today, is bipolar. On the one hand, you have the public person, right? The sovereign, the state, etc., which is broken into 2 entities. First, you have the sovereign, which is the arbiter of the general will and has law-giving power. And on the other hand, you have the state, which regulates and disciplines subjects. Then there is the other pole with its own bifurcation, which is the distinction, which is a bifurcation that is still central to our understanding of the political subject today. You have the citizen, who's the vital base of the sovereign and participates in sovereign power by possessing the general will initially. But then, of course, you have the subject, whose existence in relation to the state is exclusively through its regulation and punishment. So, of course, we never experience or see constituent power. We never experience citizenship except through regulation, right? We don't see constituent power, we see police. And it's through this regulation that politics manifests or becomes legible. This distinction between citizens and subject must be thoroughly emphasized, because it is the same distinction that thinkers like Agamben believe is a signature across the history of Western politics that makes everything from the Homo sacer to the Musulman possible. For Rousseau, the subject is pure subjection to the state. One is a subject explicitly when their bare life is in the hands of the state. This distinction is the same in Marx between man and citizen, or for those who have read Aristotle, between a politically qualified life, a zoon politikon, which has bios, an expressible political life, a biographical life, and zoa, a life that is just bare life. It is the thing that the individual outside of the polis, namely the slave, women, children, possess. So not only is the multitude transformed, but every individual is themselves transformed. Each individual is not just contracting with the sovereign, but with themselves as a member of the sovereign, and equally as important, perhaps maybe more important, as an object of the state. This bifurcation of the human being is necessary to protect what Rousseau calls social right. And this will become clear when one sees how the right to punish manifests in Rousseau. We will examine one small passage from chapter 5 of book 2 on the right of life or death very closely. So I'm just going to read it very quickly here. Whoever wishes to preserve his life at the expense of others should also give it up for them when it is necessary. For the citizen is no longer the judge of the peril to which the law wishes him to expose himself. And when the prince has said to him, "It is expedient for the state that you should die," he should die, because it is under this condition alone that he has lived in security up to then, because his life is no longer a kindness of nature, but a conditional gift of the state. What is happening here is a delicate presentation of the inhumanity of the subject at the moment of judgment. First, it must be noted that the transformation of life into that which is a conditional gift of the state is the very condition that defines biopolitics as an ontology. The simple fact of living is now determined by not one's citizenship, but one's subjection or subjecthood in relation to the state. And this gift can be taken away not out of a reason of transgression necessarily, like in the Hobbesian model or in Pufendorf's, but out of expedience, out of utility. Rousseau writes in his article on political economy that it is from the first moment of life that one must learn to deserve to live. Poor Emile. That's a terrible upbringing. By being a citizen and subject, one is always at risk of losing their membership in the state, and therefore being put to death as an enemy. And this definition of enemy is crucial. An enemy is, quote, not a moral person, a person morale, i.e. a citizen or a political individual, the abstraction of the citizenship, but a man. And in this situation, the right of war is to kill the vanquished. One is reduced to bare life and eliminated not as a citizenship, but as a man. But a further change in the right to punish must also be examined. As Foucault delineates in part 5 of the first volume of the History of Sexuality, punishment and execution no longer stands as a right of rejoinder or a right of seizure over life, like the seizure of goods or of things. It's not a subtractive mechanism anymore, the right to take life in the face of transgression. The sovereign no longer refers to itself as an auto-legitimizing object in the sense that you've transgressed the sovereign, you stand outside of it, and therefore simply must be vanquished, but instead to the social right, a social right which, of course, the sovereign can only express. This new reasoning of execution is now, as Rousseau writes, as Foucault writes, manifested simply as the reverse of the right of the social body to ensure, maintain, and develop its life. Rousseau's right to punish is to the letter an expression of the biopolitical mode of punishment. Rousseau writes every malefactor who attacks the social right becomes, through his transgressions, a rebel and a traitor to the homeland. Furthermore, the biopolitical justification of the condemnation of the individual rather than the crime itself is also laid out clearly. One is put to death if one cannot, quote, cannot be preserved without danger. It is not simply that they transgress, because Rousseau says that there is no wicked man who could not be made good for something, who could not serve public utility. One is, as Foucault would say, put to death because they pose a danger. And this is the famous line from the History of Sexuality on capital punishment. Hence, capital punishment could not be maintained except by invoking less the enormity of the crime itself than the monstrosity of the criminal, his incorrigibility, and the safeguard of society. One has the right to kill those who represent a kind of biological danger to society. Massacres are vital. It is for the sake of all of us, that someone is killed, for the objective utility of the general will. For, as Rousseau writes, all justice comes from God, and the most general will is always the most just and the voice of the populace, which is in effect the voice of God. Rousseau has dissolved the absolute power of the monarch with their right to kill and replaced it with the biopolitical absolutism and its diffuse social right to life, which then makes it necessary to kill. Furthermore, this is part of why Foucault could say on February 1st, 1978, that for Rousseau, sovereignty is not eliminated, but on the contrary, made more acute than ever. But it is made more acute through diffusion. Rousseau diffuses sovereign power into the population, and its defense becomes the primary claim of sovereignty. These maneuvers are what make executions increasingly rare, but eugenic and genocidal violence are what emerge in its place. So next, I want to talk explicitly now about Rousseau's government of disability, because it is with this in mind that the problematization of disability becomes clear. Ability is a focal point with which Rousseau's anthropology, as well as his governmentality, becomes legible. Ableism is a mode of world disclosure and a grid of intelligibility as much as it is anything else. There's a lot of fantastic work about ableism as a social force constituted within a particular political milieu. However, my comrades and I are interested in understanding ableism as a mode of world disclosure, as a predicate of metaphysics and of the ontology of biopolitics. I've stated this elsewhere, but it's worth repeating. And this is very much the case in Rousseau's notion of government. Rousseau's anthropology and Rousseau's theory of government dovetail at the point of capacity. It is through the constitution of the civil state that, quote, man's capacities are exercised and developed, his ideas are broadened, his feelings are ennobled, his soul is elevated to such a height that if the abuse of this new condition did not often lower his condition beneath the level he felt, he ought to constantly bless the happy moment that tore him away from it and forever tore him away from it forever, and that transformed him from a stupid, limited animal into an intelligent being and a man. It is through constituting a civil state that a human being becomes an intelligent being and a man. The constituent point at which one becomes citizen and subject is also, for Rousseau, an anthropogenic event where the human being drapes over its inhumanity by gaining its participation in sovereignty. It is in this instance, outside of time but nonetheless present, of the constitution of society that the faculties are exercised. The human being is a human being in as much as it is governed and it is governable. As we have shown, however, this status is always placed at risk in the defense of the social body. Though the human being has gone through this beautiful theodicy of social life, it is still ailing with a unique problem. And this unique problem for Rousseau is imbecility. Rousseau asks, why is man alone subject to becoming an imbecile? Now, this term needs to be treated with the juridico-medical specificity with which Rousseau would be treating it in the late 18th century. The human alone, for Rousseau, is subject to degeneration. That is what makes it unique. But there's also another thing that makes the human being unique, and this is what manifests in the discourse on inequality. That is, of course, the well-known theory of perfectibility. The human being also has a teleological aspect, perfectibility. Old age and accidents result in man losing his perfectibility that enabled him to acquire all those ennobled feelings and faculties. This inherently refinable being that is always at stake of degenerating because of a misalignment of public utility is the protagonist of Rousseau's discourse on inequality. The problem of moral inequality that Rousseau isolates is precisely that it degenerates the human being. And perhaps just as bad for Rousseau, makes it possible for, quote, an imbecile to lead a wise man. However, there is another, frankly uncommented on by folks like Peter Osborne, Kress, a lot of Rousseau scholars, except maybe Joseph Albernes, whose latest book is fantastic. There's another element that's uncommented on and must be examined, and that is where natural inequality exists. For Rousseau, inequality is practically non-existent in the state of nature. The problem of inequality is only possible in a world which already has law and property. Rousseau attests that inequality in status authorized by positive right alone, a right that's posited by the state, violates natural law. It is contrary to natural right whenever it is not, and this is important, combined with the same proportion with physical inequality. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean inequality in physique, but more compositionally, more constitutionally, the inequality of the individual. The problem of the general will and democracy is that it produces an unnatural inequality. This is where a sovereign that is true to the direction of the general will must intervene for Rousseau. Moral equality must be enforced and replace natural equality in the state of nature. And I think this is the part of Rousseau that is always missed, so that natural inequality comes to light and prevents the supposed imbeciles from taking the reins of wise men. The whole problematic of the discourse on inequality is that Rousseau contests that moral inequality is indicative of natural inequality. That is what is lamentable about the Ancien Régime. In a properly administered world for Rousseau, where amour propre is suppressed in favor of the perfectibility of the species, the sovereign would be properly expressing the general will. The general will is always aligned, when we take a holistic view of Rousseau's project, with the refinement of the species, the promotion of capacity, of human capacity, and the preclusion of disability. Disability manifests as an object of preclusion. All that risks this mission is a danger that is counter to the social right and must be treated accordingly. The vanquished are killed because under this grid of intelligibility, they are deemed unoptimized and incongruent with the teleological perfection of the species. But don't worry, the general will is always right. And I want to sidestep, because I skipped a paragraph. I want to say that it's really important that in Rousseau's project, the fall of the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution is not just a rupture in history, but an epistemic event. It is an event that fundamentally transforms the human being epistemically in its grid of intelligibility. This is obvious in Madness and Civilization, in Discipline and Punish, in The Order of Things, and in the history of sexuality. It is in the bourgeois revolutionary context that the disciplines manifest, that biopolitics manifests, that eugenics manifests, that the destruction of life manifests, that the problematization of life manifests. Okay, so recourse to the French Revolution, Foucault is going to be quite critical of, and we see this in his discussion with the Maoists. So I want to close with just one last paragraph entitled "Constituent Power as Biopower." I want to conclude with an open question. Why is it that Foucault spends 2 lectures discussing constituent and constitutional theory before introducing biopolitics? Why does he focus on the introduction of the rights of man, on the constituent elements of the human being, before getting to biopolitics? Foucault spends an hour on a discussion of the Rousseauian constitutional theorist Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and his theory of the third estate. The third estate is simply all of the constituent elements of the social body that Sieyès believes exists prior to the constitution of the sovereign, all of those forces. What does, Foucault says, constitute the strength of a nation in Sieyès is now something like capacities, its potentialities. It is the identification, ordering, and refining of these capacities that then become the mission of the sovereign in the biopolitical epoch. These virtualities, which take the name of capacities, perfectibility, etc., are the object of the government of disability, and they also kill the vanquished. And with that, I'll conclude, I think, a little bit early or late. I don't know. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. That was fantastic and very innovative, and I greatly appreciate it. We will now take questions. I see that there's nothing in the Q&A so far. People are are sort of reflecting on
That's okay.
what you've said and trying to put something together. So maybe you could I'd like to know how you see this how you see this fitting into your broader project of work on biopolitics and Foucaultian eugenics, etc.
I think that's a great question. Precisely because I had difficulty justifying that to myself for a little while. You know, I had always had this polemic about Rousseau, but I had never quite understood why Rousseau had made me so uncomfortable. And like I'll engage in the thing that I try to evade the most, like autophenomenology. It always made me uncomfortable as a disabled person, you know. But it wasn't until I was actually teaching Rousseau and drawing out the political ontology on the chalkboard that I saw the manifestation of the problematization and refinement of life as the basis of the general will that that the biopolitical aspect became important. So there are two elements here. I think that Rousseau is a thinker that is largely not taken to be an element of biopolitical transformation. Instead, it's you know, thinkers like Ernst Junger and all of those others. But while they're very interesting, Foucault and of course you know, the political economists that were engaging in like agrarian reanalysis and all of those things, but you know, Rousseau stands at that precipice in that moment that Foucault is talking about in all of his works. And, you know, he really is the hinge point that transforms sovereignty in the way that Foucault speaks of. And sort of once that all linked up for me, I realized that the notion of constituent power, which really comes from Rousseau and Sieyès, even the theorists of constituent power like Toni Negri, Hannah Arendt, and Judith Butler, uh, it all comes from Sieyès, and from the French Revolutionary context. So I found that those constituent elements were clearly biopolitical. And then when I returned to Society Must Be Defended, and I saw that Foucault was scratching at this element, I noted that this is really the formal content of biopower, um, and that for all of the sort of utopian, uh, I would say like dangerously developmentalist thinking about constituent power that we get from Toni Negri's camp, from long-termist developmentalist understandings of the human being. They're still participating, I think, very dangerously in a biopolitical discourse that they're either refusing to acknowledge or are simply uncomfortable with dealing with the consequences of that. Um, and I think that a destruction of the metaphysics of eugenic modernity has to be a crypt destruction. Um, and I think that what I've found is by doing this research, I've come closer and closer to a kind of formal position that capacity and potentiality have to be uh, taken for taken seriously as violent predicates rather than simply something that needs to be left open, in the Deleuzian or early Agambenian sense. Um, I don't actually think that capacity is this neutral notion in the anthropological machine that is metaphysics. I think it's a very violent one, and one that is always already making fissures, not in the Derridian sense, but because these are firm decisions that are made. These are not undecidables, but firm decisions. So that's the
Okay.
justification that I would give.
Okay, that's a great response. Sorry, I just want to. We now have a couple of questions, and there was a bit of a lag with the Q&A box. So I want to get to those questions. Okay, well. So there's a question from we have a few now in the question as Q&A box, as I say. So the first one is from John Henry Riley, who says, "Hey, Will, thanks so much for your presentation, exclamation mark. It's so great to see where your work research is going with Rousseau's fear of the figure of the so-called imbecile. Does he see this as moral status, intellectual difference, both, or something else? I'm just wondering what specifically is so menacing about this figure for Rousseau."
Yeah, it's absolutely both. Because the one informs the other. So while there wasn't necessarily um, a notion of intellectual disability as given your area of research, John Raleigh, I'm sure you already are far ahead of me on this. At the end of the 18th century, uh, it was, in fact, an articulation of the degeneration of human capacities that had been acquired through the human being's relation to the social. So the old man stumbles into imbecility because of social inequality, but in that stumbling, not only results in a compositional change of the constitution of that body, but in fact loses their status as a moral person, falls back into the petulance of amour propre, uh, and no longer is really fully an anthropological human being. And this is what's lamentable. Um, but the imbecile themselves is a haunting figure explicitly because uh, their perpetuation of a mode of existence that shirks the perfectibility of the human being. Right? They take the reins from the wise, and this is there's more of this in Emile than there is in the discourse on inequality, but it's more poignant in the discourse on inequality. Um, it the what the imbecile indicates is the failure of governance. Fundamentally a failure of governance, either in its quarantining or in its very manifestation. So I think that it's menacing both because it speaks to the misalignment of the general will, and it speaks to the absence of moral personage. And when just for clarity for those who don't read this kind of stuff, because not everyone should frankly be reading Hobbes and Rousseau all the time. Moral person doesn't mean someone who's like good and upstanding, but moral person is a more fundamental metaphysical notion of the abstraction of the human being. I am a moral person in as much as I possess the abstract qualities of a political human being. And that's why, for example, the sovereign can be a moral person, but not like a physical embodied person. It can be a public person. So the
Okay.
imbecile sheds that.
Okay, so do you want to go on to the next question?
Sure.
Okay, that was a great response. Okay, so this is from Melinda Hull, and who says, "Hi, Will. I really enjoyed your talk. I've been interested in Rousseau since I learned about his vaccine views. Do you think he could have had his social contract argument at all without his assumptions about disability?"
No, not at all.
Great question.
Not at all. I think that what we see when we take I think a holistic view, and when we try to take Rousseau as a system, which is how he wanted to be read in Confessions of a Solitary Walker. There's really a worldview. Um, the theodicy of the development of the human being, of its capacities, that's the entirety of Rousseau's worldview. And in fact, it frankly likely informs the dialectic. One of the things that I think is missing is that I probably should have mentioned is at the end of the Sieyès Rousseau lectures before he introduces um, biopolitics, he says, "There you go. You have history. You have the dialectic." It's explicitly through the development of capacities, and for Hegel, this would be like the march of spirit, right? And the relationship between spirit and the presentation of phenomenal truth, right? That it's through this that the dialectical progressionist understanding of history becomes possible for Rousseau. So I think that no, without a certain notion of disability, and of course we have to be really careful when we use these terms, right? Disability is not necessarily something understandable in it would be somewhat anachronistic or foreign, but nonetheless we have to talk about these forces in some way. I know sometimes the historiologists like to come after Foucault for trying to like give a sort of broad understanding of historical transformations. But I think that we have to be strategic and honest. And I think that when you have an honest reading of Rousseau, and I think most Rousseauians don't have an honest reading of Rousseau. I think most Marxists don't have an honest reading of Rousseau, frankly, or conservatives. But conservatives hate Rousseau for a completely different reason. When you have an honest reading of Rousseau, I think the notion of perfectibility is the entirety of the core of his project, and that, of course, makes ability the object in the grid of intelligibility that makes the whole system sort of legible, right? We're refining abilities and so on. So no, I don't think it would be possible without disability, which is why I think liberal democracy is fundamentally a government of disability.
I'm going to go on to the next question, if that's okay, because we have a couple of more and we're sort of running short of time here. Okay, so this is from Hypatia of Swa. "I'm reminded in your critique of Rousseau's theory of perfectibility of the critique of Arbogast, Schmidt of the idea of humanity as ultimately empty and moldable in the first part of Plato and modernity, which he connects to a false trust of immediate experience, going back to Scotus and the simplex as attainable via cognition." intuitive. And do you think there is a kind of connection to these general philosophical questions, or is this mostly a purely political consideration for you?
I think that there's a deep connection. Whether or not that connection exists in Rousseau, um, is hard to say, given that, Rousseau's relationship to Plato is heavily mediated, um, you know, of all people, by Aquinas, and Augustine, and actually, um, Machiavelli. So while these questions of philosophy of mind are crucial, he's probably carrying the same assumptions that exist in in the first part of De Quive and Hobbes. And I know this might not be like a legible answer to the question to everybody, but I just want to answer the question specifically, and then I'll try to explain it really quickly. He's probably just carrying the assumptions that are found in uh, Hobbes and Spinoza, and of course, like, that's what Schmidt will see as a problem, right? So I think that, yes, like, these questions are ones that are, I think, worth asking, but since I'm not a Rousseauian, the uh, archaeological question is a difficult one to answer.
I think we have time for another question, maybe not Melinda's second question. Um, but maybe you can take a look at that and respond to. I'm going to go on to a question from Kashka Duff. Thanks for your great talk. Do you have any thoughts about how these themes might trace back to the 17th century, as well as enacting an epistemic rupture? In particular, do you have any thoughts on how Locke's theory of punishment relates to Rousseau's? I'm thinking, for example, that Locke also paints the criminal as a captive in a just war who may be just killed or enslaved because they're somehow non-human, in parentheses, a wild beast, gives justification of settler colonial dispossession and genocide in terms of the utility of improvement, and is a great um, in terms of the utility of improvement, and is the great philosopher of the enclosures movement that Foucault addresses in Discipline and Punish.
Yeah. That's a great question. What I would say is all of that needs to be qualified with the recognition that it is property that is the basis of Locke's analysis, property explicitly. Um, and for Rousseau, it will be population and its management. So that's where they're distinguished. Famously, Rousseau um, criticizes Locke's theory of slavery explicitly because he thinks that under Locke's own system, the war is still happening, right? The war of all against all is still in action, but for Locke, uh, when one finds oneself enslaved or imprisoned, etc., it is because one has given up one's own right to property in the state of nature, and therefore in the civil state. So there's kind of a different sort of geological distinction going on here. But yeah, I think there's a real genetic connection between Locke and Rousseau. I mean, there's so much that Rousseau takes from Locke, despite being a massive critic, and it's the same thing with Lawson and Hobbes. He's highly critical of those two as well, and Suarez and Pufendorf. But you know, genetically, his arguments aren't possible without it. So I think you're right to say that, at least when it comes to um, the question of enclosure, which is the entire means through which the world is apprehended by the political subject through his relationship to his property, which is almost like an extension of himself. Uh, you know, the whole world then plays itself out historically in history as this question of property. Whereas with Rousseau, the object of intervention is instead the modulability, the squishiness of the human being. I know it's not a really technical term, but yeah, that's my answer.
That's a great answer. I think we're going to have to move on now. So if everyone can join me in thanking Will for a very innovative and provocative presentation. Thank you very much. Great way to open the session. Okay, so second in the session, we're going to have Virgil Murthy, who is going to present a paper entitled Addiction as a Way of Life, Foucault, Friendship, and Possibilities of Disabled Closeness. Virgil recently received a PhD in logic from the philosophy department at Carnegie Mellon University. She works primarily in critical disability theory, applying Foucauldian feminist influences to knowledge production by and for addicts and illicit drug users. Virgil's research has appeared in Feminist Philosophy Quarterly, the edited volume Existentialism and Disability Perspectives, and is forthcoming in the Oxford Online Research Encyclopedia of Disability Studies and the Journal of Philosophy of Disability. She runs the Addict Collective Project and the interview series. I've had the distinct pleasure of interviewing Virgil in May 2023 in the Dialogues on Disability series. You can find a link to that interview in the chat. Thanks to Jamie. So, Virgil, over to you, please.
Yes, hello, and good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Shelley, and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you, Will, for the, as usual, very terrific and path-breaking presentation. I'm going to share my slides here and see if I can play the slideshow. Okay, so I am sitting close up, visible with the camera frame. I am a mixed race person with, honestly, kind of greasy, dark hair that disappears behind my shoulders, and I have kind of the top of a electric, colorful red and blue shirt on. It's visible. And I'll be presenting, as Shelley described, on addiction as a way of life. So if I can be heard okay, which I assume is the case, I will get started. So I have here a slide that has an image that you'd see. It looks like a stock photo you might see on the cover of a social work volume. It's kind of a close-up in muted colors of some clasped hands, people sitting on a bench, and the title and subtitle. So I want to start by talking a little bit about critical discourses of addiction. I'm discussing addiction in this presentation largely because that's what my work concerns as regards Foucault, but in reference to the broader point of Foucault as the first disabled philosopher of disability in this paradigm, I do mean it also as a general kind of proof of principle or a case study in something that I mean to apply more broadly, and I'll address that further as I get the presentation. But so there is not a lot of addiction work, addiction discourse, especially critically, that is in conversation with disability studies, from a disabled and critical perspective. There are a few interventions, especially, by Andrea, Dr. Pitts, who might also be here and moderated a lovely roundtable yesterday, and by myself and by some other contributors in our sort of among our set in our milieu. But this is an intervention in that spirit, this kind of insurrection into this confluence of critical attitudes toward critical postures toward addiction discourses and critical postures toward disability discourses. So critical addiction studies is already a very well-defined and extant field within critical theory, often intersecting with sociology, political ontology. It's motivated in large part, this area of the discourse, by these two sort of foundational texts, which discuss the emergence of addiction as a discursive topic, as a phenomenon. One is an essay by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick in one of her volumes called Epidemics of the Will, I think, or Epidemic of the Will. The other one being a longer book-length critical treatment by Mariana Valverde called Diseases of the Will, specific to alcohol. Cedric talks largely about opioids and opioid use prosecution. And these provide sort of genealogies that question the constancy, scientific status of addiction, and launch this field that's largely in keeping with some turn of the century, beginning of the 2000s discussion of empirical research about addiction and drug use especially in Western social democracies, and attempt to kind of trouble this discourse. So the way that a lot of this takes wing is by the following kind of structure. Foucault has a place of pride in this field, and often we see this assertion or attribution of a Foucaultian genealogy. In particular, there's a discursive tactic that's very common in critical addiction studies, where participants will kind of block quote something that Foucault says about gay men and about the construction of homosexuals and homosexuality, and find and replace the word addict and claim that it applies just as well to that case. This particular very specific rhetorical tool is often used. So I have here a couple of examples, one by Gerard Reith, one by from Cedric's original text, that I won't read in full, but that basically say a paragraph from History of Sexuality that replace homosexual with addict. 19th century, in brackets, addict became a personage to pass a case history and a childhood, and then goes on as such, applying this Foucaultian lens to the construction of medicalization and integration into a scientia of this type of person. What is very interesting, though, is the way in which the genealogies are deployed within the field. And this is the kind of critique that I'm going to make, and more generally, the particular way in which I think that a reckoning is in order that is in keeping with Foucault, which is that the way that these concepts are deployed in critical addiction studies often is that a genealogy is posed as an alternative to some. The fact that a concept has emerged through a genealogy is framed as the alternative to some other way of emerging that would have been better justified. So these I will read. I have an excerpt from a Granfield and Reinerman text. They edited a volume called Expanding Addiction 2015. Quote, "The concept of addiction as disease has a history, a genealogy. It was not a scientific discovery. It did not emerge from the accumulation of research findings. Its current ubiquity is a different species of social accomplishment," end quote. From Reith again, "The notion of addiction was not, then, the discovery of some new disease, but rather, to return to Marx's phrase, the creation of a fetish." And then there's a little bit more, I'll skip. Then Ron Roizen, another one of these theorists, I'll quote him as well. "The unlikely story of the modern alcoholism movement's origins, with its strongly social constructionist character and flimsy science base, invites our attention to the relationship between alcohol science and the wider society." So this characterizes some aspects of the discourse that are very interesting, of this critical discourse. The genealogical method here is used to illustrate not only the particulars of how a concept, in this case addiction, has been constituted over time, but to establish as a discursively relevant and emphasized point the fact that it has been constructed in the first place. This is taken as something that is interesting and informative and special in and of itself. We end up with this kind of bifurcation into kinds of concepts where there are the socially constructed things, and then there are the scientifically justified things. And you can see in these quotes that I've read the direct deployment of socially constructed categories that have changed and been modified over time as in opposition to scientifically witnessed, scientifically empirically justified concepts, which is supposed to be, the implication is that is a superior, less shaky kind of ideology. There's a profound Saucian influence really throughout the field. There's a pervasive concern about overdiagnosis and social contagion, and a general worry that a lot of the things that we call addiction, a lot of the cases of people who we call addicts, well, that term actually is misapplied, and these things aren't really pathological, and we should be more discerning in our application of the term. But throughout the really dominant sentiments that's often critiqued throughout the field is this idea that addiction is discursively dangerous in a way that other concepts aren't. This isn't true of the way that people talk, the assumption is. About flu, it's not true of the way that we discuss race. It's not true that of the way that we discuss various other kinds of like social productions or humankind's. Addiction is a concept that threatens social discourses at large in a way that's unique because it has the tendency to expand and to infect and to poison unreasonable contexts and use cases. Like we start talking about addiction to alcohol or drugs, and maybe some of those are like, internally consistent, meaningful, and useful concepts. And then, whoa, suddenly now people are discussing exercise addictions and habit forming use of chapstick. And this is something that critical addiction theorists are very concerned about. And the concern that's often described, the way that this is explained, is that the content of addiction, as it's described in the dominant discourses, is excessively normative and insufficiently objective. It's not biologically witnessed. It is sort of like expansive and thematic and subjective and molar. It would be the technical use term we would describe if we want to contrast it against sort of these narrow, specific ideologies, as opposed to very specific, molecular, narrow, clearly demarcated in terms of specific itemized elements of knowledge production traditions. And also this attitude that drug carceralism is a theoretical continuation of the temperance movement. There's a really profound focus on the temperance movement and on prohibition and regulation of substance use, meaning to implement abstention on a wide scale, and a view that the discourses that produce addiction, everything from the DEA to Alcoholics Anonymous, are kind of working together and operating in lockstep to restrict substance use. So the focus on the curtailing elements of the production of addiction is a discursive subject, rather than a more holistic view like Foucault applied to sexuality, where we're looking at the normals and the abnormals that these discourses produce and the ways in which the definition of the abnormal subject is reintegrated as its own justification, as a justification that further enshrines and develops across time. The upshot really is this general idea that addiction in particular is socially constructed, but that the socially constructed character of addiction is informative in and of itself. And that's rare among types. And all this is again not some sort of all-encompassing universal critique that leaves the discipline, as a scorched, empty field where nothing can grow. It doesn't discount, entirely the field. I don't mean this to say that critical addiction studies is fundamentally sort of ruinously beholden to this. Often the molecular versus molar distinction that's being used here is put to very effective uses, but this is the sort of the narrow problem that I think requires a Foucaultian intervention. So, and I think it can largely be encapsulated by this thing that I call the hermeneutic problem of addiction. Sometimes I'll call it the problem of addiction, which is this idea that we are having a referendum on whether we should believe in addiction, basically. And I'll explain it a little more further, but I want to read aloud this one sentence that I find very, very striking from a critical addiction theorist, Suzanne Fraser, in a sort of Otherwise's Futures paper. Quote, "Is addiction, in short, a problem we really want to have?" End quote. I think that's a fascinating question. That is a very atypical kind of question if we were to approach this from a very orthodox Foucaultian perspective. It seems to take the reassignment of categories as the primary purpose of the discourse, in a way that goes over and beyond the other possible perturbations to the categories of the way that we think about desire, or about drug use, or about compulsions, or about madness, and focus on the rectification of the confluence of things that's been constructed as addiction. So this is very associated with this kind of this theoretical milieu called the new materialism. There's a similar kind of sociological called the ontological turn. But basically, this is a attitude, posture in post-structuralist and critical work at the turn of the 21st century that prioritizes and highlights the questioning and elimination of these convoluted or these discursive productions that are kind of an agglutination of various influences. And the idea is that we want to kind of reveal some heterogeneous underlying true reality. That discourse has enacted a categorization schema that kind of bunches up the ontology, so to speak, and the actual truth of things underlying it is actually very flat and even, and things are more various, also more embodied, which I won't talk about much in this presentation, than we're making them out to be. And that's the purpose of discursive interventions. And I have some images on this slide of titles and covers of various texts within the critical tradition that draw, and in one case, the realist tradition, this paper by David Graeber, but that draw attention to what it is that the materialism is doing. One is by Shelley Tremain. This is what a historicist and relativist feminist philosophy of disability looks like, in which she addresses very carefully the way in which certain feminist approaches to disability in the critical canon appropriate or shun the Foucault's work, often because it's meant to be, it's said to be underfocused or unaware of embodiment. There's also a paper I have on here by Frederick Palm, who's a sociologist from Uppsala University, which applies this specifically to addiction. And I found this paper very useful and path-breaking. It applies this phenomenon called state phobia, which is state phobia basically is this concept that Foucault raises kind of obliquely toward the end of his work, shortly before his turn to ancient discourses, in which he describes a culmination of neoliberal sentiment and a confluence of neoliberal and critical sentiments that pits the state against some other way of organization of things that is comparatively the proper way for them to be, regarding the state is uniquely and fundamentally bad and kind of the origin of all things bad. So in many ways, this addiction discussion that I'm evoking is an offshoot of a more general referendum that we've been having since the start of the 21st century about the relevance of this state phobia that Foucault critiques to both contemporary critical discourses and the appropriations of Foucault's own work that he might object to. And there's in particular this Foucaultian theorist, Nicholas Rose, who is often taken in critical discourses as the premier theorist associated with the deployment of state phobia. Rose's work, according to his critics, such as the authors of State Phobia and Civil Society, this book by Mitchell Dean and Casper Villadsen, which is, I think, 2016, relatively recent. The premise that is being assumed on their view in the legacy of Rose's work and of the according interpretation of Foucault is that the state is a uniquely artificial edifice, a uniquely artificial production, and one that's uniquely threatening to human society, interaction, and ways of being in a way that other forces aren't, and in particular, in a way that the market isn't. So often the state is pitted against the market. The state is a way of organizing humans into structures that is repressive, confining, problematic, forceful. The market, on the other hand, is a way of associating humans into structures that is liberatory, flat, open, and free. And this, immediately a theorist of Foucault might imagine that that is not what Foucault thinks. Foucault is very critical of certain elements of both the state and the markets, and characterizes often throughout his work the ways in which they selectively, in different occasions, collaborate and are at odds. He discusses conduct, he discusses counterconduct within and between these structures, and often is concerned with arguments and power struggles that are played out in discourses that compete to enact and produce different things. So these are the fundaments that Frederick Palm applies to the critical addiction studies canon. An assumption of this kind of continuity between different discourses and between and among arbiters of knowledge, knowledge producers, knowledge producing institutions that aren't in fact continuous and aligned universally and in lockstep in the way that they're often assumed to be, and in general, an erasure of counterconduct. He has many critiques, of which I'm not going to discuss here, but this is sort of the central one. This is what I described. There's something related here that I describe as the hermeneutic problem of addiction. The hermeneutic problem of addiction is my particular application to the addiction context of what I view as a general problem in certain critical discourses. And there's a lot of, even within this very conference, I'm always excited to attend for this reason, I've heard other contributors describing critique analogous structures, confluences, or productions. Dr. Christoph yesterday described this epistemic normative problem of advocacy that is similar to what I'm describing. Will's work has described things similar to what I'm describing here. But basically, it's this idea that ostensibly critical discourses are discourses that take themselves to be questioning the natural or fundamental status of categories, sublimate what we might understand to be a fear of the subject described into a fear of the subject producing discourse that they criticize, which allows the avoidance of critique of the actual whatever the moving and shaking attitude is that permits and justifies the fear in the first place. So to be a little bit more specific, suppose we define addicts, for my purposes, everything's a moving target. I think usefully a catch-all definition of addict that's sufficient is people who have relationships to substances, sometimes also other things that are substances, that are regarded by the dominant prevailing light normativity as erratic, problematic, and self-defeating. And in particular, kind of like longitudinal relationships, often associated with a very binary kind of thing. You can't use responsibly. And this is sort of the way that addiction is perceived. It's this inability to integrate one's substance use into an otherwise normal life. So there are these three claims that are very fundamental to the anti-drug justificatory logic. The justificatory logic of carceral apparatuses, the prosecution of drug users, the medicalization of drug users, what have you. The first one is that drug users are addicts. That fundamentally drug use produces this problematic in a way that other activities don't. Nobody's advocating to shut down the gyms because people are exercise addicts. On the contrary, the discursive justificatory logic works the other way around in that case. We have this kind of pathologization of unfitness. And you see the same thing with ability versus disability more generally. So this pathologization of drug users as addicts. Then there's the idea that addicts, which are the thing that we're assuming that all drug users are fundamentally and incorrigibly antisocial. And then finally, the idea that the being that way justifies their elimination and monitoring by institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the hermeneutic problem of addiction is that this central kind of premise or idea goes unquestioned, and instead this first premise gets challenged. So the emphasis on rejecting and deconstructing the notion that any significant subset of drug users are like this takes priority over, and in some cases concede the inarguability of the fact that if really any critical mass of drug users are this way, well, then we really need the state to come in and set these people to rights. So the way that I want to connect this directly to the intervening power of Foucault, I'm going to skip this PowerPoint point specifically. In is that this raises a kind of tricky question for us if we want to criticize the idea that addicts are fundamentally in need of regulation by the state in the first place or by some institution. That premise is left unchallenged. And if we want to challenge it, then we need to talk about the attributes of addicts. And there's sort of a moving target here, where when we start saying people who use drugs in this way or that way, or kind of a way that's considered socially atypical, abnormal, generally incompatible with a day-to-day life where one is a liberal democratic subject, we run the risk of essentializing the qualities of addicts that the user movement is trying to de-essentialize. So, we can have this back and forth that seems to miss the point, where somebody will say, drug users aren't all, irresponsible in their use. And then I would be inclined to say, I want to advocate also for drug users who are considered irresponsible in their use, which are addicts, but I don't want to make it the case to enact it as the case that that irresponsibility is perceived as some fundamental, immutable aspect of addicts, right? It seems like we're just back where we started. And Foucault enters this discourse at a time of reckoning of queer theory and queer studies, when there is kind of a dispute in the future of the queer movement and of the queer studies discipline relating to sexual futures, sexual futurity, and sexual deviance. So if queerness is fundamentally transgressive, right, then we want to describe it in some way. We want to describe queerness as fundamentally transgressive. We want to draw attention to historical, gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual practices that have been transgressive, but we also don't want to outline human sexuality into these types in the very way that, Foucault undermines artfully in History of Sexuality. So Foucault does this interview called Friendship is a
Virgil, excuse me, but we have some questions. We have one. Do you want to wrap up, or
sorry. Yeah, I might have missed the time and gone a little over.
That's fine.
My apologies. I will just take one more minute and describe this.
Okay.
Basically, Foucault's central contribution to this argument is to frame the future of queer people, and in particular of gay men, as a matter of community and society determination. And so I have this quote that I'll read and I'll give a comment on and I'll summarize. This is Foucault in this interview. As far back as I remember, to want guys was to want relations with guys. This has always been important for me, not necessarily in the form of a couple, but as a matter of existence. What was it possible for men to be together, to live together, to share their time, their meals, their room, their leisure, their grief, their knowledge, their confidences? What is it to be naked among men outside of institutional relations, family, profession, and obligatory camaraderie? It's a desire and uneasiness that exists among a lot of people. And so the idea here is that by taking the notion of a homosexual community as a project of loving and living among gay men allows the constant troubling of the boundaries of what it is to be gay in a way that both challenges the, sexual normativity and keeps it the case that this is a moving target. Foucault wants us to continue. I can just elaborate on this in questions. But I'll just summarize by saying he ends this by saying what can be played, how can we keep innovating in this space? How can we keep innovating upon homosexuality as a prospect for future lives? And that's right click what we have to do for addiction.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go to questions. We have please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. We have one question from Hypatia Spa. A while ago, I also thought about the ambivalence of social construction, differentiating the belief that A, ideas are socialized, in parentheses, weak constructivism, that B, therefore there are only ideas/concepts and no external reality, in parentheses, radical skepticism, or that C, external reality exists and we can change it because we create it materially, in parentheses, strong constructivism. What kind of constructivism do these addiction scholars employ in your observation, or do you think this distinction makes sense?
Thanks, Hypatia. I think the distinction makes sense. I don't know that I would qualify most of these theorists as, in fact, social constructivists. I think it's like, so the prevailing distinction here is not so much how deep the roots go, whether it's that our discourse is influenced by our idea, but our underlying reality isn't, or whether, whether there is an outside text or whether there isn't. So much of it is, are all concepts socially constructed or only some? So I think that insofar as concepts are socially constructed, they are productions, and the theorists who are in the, like Nicholas Rowe's tradition of sociology very much do criticize, and very strikingly and very well, these ideas in ways that really do look at them from all sides and do think about, like, I mean, these are often enactment theorists. They tend to like, in a way that I think is, proper or appropriate, relegate the question of whether an external reality exists to instead a question of what is produced, what is done by this or that discourse. Where the radicalism needs to go further, in my opinion, is that the same analysis ought to be applied also to other concepts, which sort of occupy the role of a solid surface on top of which things move. So, for instance, addiction is a production of discourses, but neuroscience is, like, generally true and correct, and sufficiently neuroscientifically witnessed facts about the human body are inevitable, essential, and, like, real and causal in a way that addiction isn't. That's often the attitude of these contributions. Which is, and that's why I raise the idea of state phobia, which is very similar. The state affects us, makes us behave unnaturally. It's an artificial presentation, whereas the market is natural. It's fundamental. That's the way that humans kind of, like, it's like a normativization of the descriptive. It's the way that humans ought to behave because it's the way that they do behave. And both the naturalization and the like normativization are factors that are there. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, I don't see any other questions right now. Here's a question from Caroline Christoph that I will read. In analytical bioethics, the concept of addiction is nearly always thought to override any conception of autonomy applied to the patient. This often has the dual effect of making the patient not responsible for their addiction but yet unable to exist without the help of the other. In your view, does this conception need to be modified or added to? Good question. Thank you very much, Carolyn.
Yes. So
Caroline, sorry.
This is perfect because it allows me to get to this end of the presentation that I inadvertently undercut by checking the time wrong. And my apologies about that. But there's this pervasive idea that addiction kind of, like, uniquely interferes with the person's subjectivity, interferes with the way they ought to be. And I have a bunch of, images here of when you search the opposite of addiction on Google. It is all of these sort of, blurbs about how the opposite of addiction is connection is the very famous, very ubiquitous slogan. And what it means to my thinking is that addicts are uniquely unequipped to organize. To put it in terms of the question, to organize themselves and each other, to participate in social and political communities, and to exist with the help of the other. And so this is the final slide that I have in my presentation, which I'll also share here, is this image of this plaza, just a public plaza, which happens. It's in New Haven. I was visiting there several years ago and ended up there, interacting with a lot of illicit drinkers. And this wasn't something that I really knew existed. And it was one of the major steps in my coming to think of myself as a person who is unlike this one group of people insofar as I'm a member of this other group of people. The illicit drinkers, who frequented this plaza were not drinking alone. They were drinking in the socially atypical, socially abnormalized way of in public, in technically illegal according to open container brown bag laws way, and we're doing so as a community. I had a lot of great interactions with people there, and this is the fundamental kind of difficulty of the concept of addiction as a pathology that peculiarly makes people unable to interact with others in like a productive, responsible way. Drug user and addict theorists often emphasize that it is drug users and addicts who keep themselves and each other alive. This echoes the rhetoric that also is very, correct and important of like gay communities keeping each other alive during the HIV/AIDS crisis, and also IV drug users at that time. So the future of the community, this futurity being a product of ongoing, not consensus, but interaction. And the fact that addict is a political identity that is not self-defeating, I think is the central kind of disagreement between analytical bioethics and me. On the topic of responsibility, I don't really, I for various reasons, I'm sort of critical of, I'm not an eliminativist about morality, but I have a certain critiques of the use of responsibilization in this context, which I think would align broadly with what Foucault says about responsibilization.
Great response. Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions. So here's one from Hypatia Spa. For the question of irresponsibility versus stereotype, could you not instead raise the point that drug users experience a double standard of being much higher judged on their responsibility?
So this evokes the problem that then it's the same kind of like abnegation of the actual atypical behavioral content, the pathologization of which I want to challenge. And to put it another way, so there's this use of a critique that it deploys a critique, but it uses some kind of like underlying buy-in to a grotesque, to use a term and a canon that Dr. Rodier discussed yesterday. When we think about artists who are ostensibly critiquing this whole this oppressive edifice of beliefs and policies and influences, and in order to do so, they are using like something that by their own lights is, actually problematic, and actually they concur with its social abnormalization as kind of an allegory for this other thing that they do want to challenge or critique. The problem with this is that it buys into it reinforces the distinction. I want to challenge the actually pathologized status.
Okay, I see two questions now. One from Raymond Aldred. I think that might be the last question we have time for, but maybe you can take a look at the next question from Melissa Fox Meriton. So Ray asks, does your analysis extend to something like a sexual addiction, or do you think it is different?
Yes, does extend to it.
Okay, that was a quick answer. So maybe we have time for Melissa Fox Meriton's question, which is, you mentioned the term antisocial as a perceived link to addict behaviors. Would you agree that one of the issues is the social tendency to see any atypical behavior as antisocial rather than merely different?
Um, so when I use the term antisocial, I'm using it in this particular kind of like clinical or technical way, where what I mean by antisocial behavior is not bad behavior. It's behavior that is socially socialized as the abnormal, the excluded, the verboten, the deviant variant of some, among some spectrum of human modes of being. And moreover, in these particular cases, I think addiction and madness are such cases. A lot of the justificatory logic to which people appeal when they call things deviant in this bad way is the idea that it's fundamentally threatening society to include these things. That a society cannot work when we allow these people to be part of it. This is historically a very ponderous and dominant idea about gay people at the time that Foucault and Halpern are writing. Um, and so by antisocial, when we again draw this distinction and say, well, this behavior is just different, it's not actually antisocial, my reluctance to permit that is because I don't want to end up reinforcing that these behaviors that are qualified as actually, truthfully, meaningfully socially deviant, whatever that will be, because again, it's always a moving target, are within the scope of proper subjugation. So it's we can keep doing these distinctions. And my fear is that by saying some of these variations of human subjectivity among this, immense broad spectrum are actually okay, and other ones are really problematic, is that if you keep ending up in the problematic category, then not only do you keep being, oppressed and monitored by institutions, but the discourse that's ostensibly trying to enact this liberatory character, in fact, facilitates and sanctions the continued subjugation of the real, true, actual pathologized types. I'm very pessimistic about the prospect of winning that game. Different people have different attitudes, but from what I've seen, I am very pessimistic about it. There's always going to be, not to put it in some kind of from on high verdict way, but as far as I've seen, the antisocial is always pitted against the social, and agitation for this the inclusion of this group that can be assimilated because they are sufficiently antisocial. In order to operate, it often implicitly assumed that there is some true antisocial to whose liberation the arguments for the former group's assimilation or inclusion does not extend. And I think that addicts often end up playing that role in drug use discussions, and that's what I want to perturb.
Okay, thank you. So, Melissa likes that answer, likes that response. So I think we've come out of finished the questions. So if we can give Virgil a big hand of thanks for a wonderful presentation. There they are. Lots of appreciation there, Virgil. Thank you very much for a very provocative and thoughtful presentation. So now I'm going to finish the session by Stephanie's stead, I'm going to read an excerpt of a paper that I have forthcoming in a special issue of Feminist Philosophy Quarterly on Foucault and marginalized feminist discourses. And I know that some of the contributors to that special issue are on this call, so they might be interested, especially. I do want to give a content warning that I do talk about suicide, and you might think that I talk about suicide in a somewhat glib fashion. That's not my intention. So this excerpt from the paper is in a section called Conceptual Needs of the Argument to Abolish Ethics, to Abolish Bioethics. The title of the paper is Notes for an Abolitionist Feminist Genealogy of Bioethics. The abolition of bioethics is a project that I've been working on for some time, and will probably do until I stop writing philosophy. So the first subsection of this section is entitled Situating the Argument. A broad range of critically engaged philosophers and theorists attest to the value of Foucault's genealogical method for social movement and transformation. In abolition feminism now, for example, Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie identify Foucault's genealogical method and claims about subjugated knowledges as among the best critical devices with which to advance an abolition feminism that both refuses naturalized and hence ahistorical assumptions about carceral institutions and eschews reformist approaches to them that advocate for their putative improvement. In this article, this presentation, I rely on the reflections of these abolition feminists, both to reinforce my critique of reformist responses to the eugenic impetus of bioethics and to outline the quote-unquote prefiguration that requires us to abolish the subfield of philosophy altogether. As Harsha explains, and I quote, prefiguration is the notion that our organizing reflects the society we wish to live in, that the methods we practice, institutions we create, and relationships we facilitate within our movements and communities align with our ideals, end quote. For Walia, decolonization is a framework that exemplifies a positive and concrete prefigurative image of the future. I contend that just as we must prefigure a decolonized future for society without prisons, police, and border control, so too we must prefigure a decolonized, equitable, and inclusive future for philosophy without bioethics. Yet philosophers, including feminist philosophers, tend to ignore, cast aside, or outright dismiss my call for bioethics to be abolished, variously regarding it as unrealistic, disproportionate, and uncollegial. They regard the call as unrealistic because bioethics seems indispensable for the resolution of what they construe as a particular type of issue in certain contexts. In addition, they regard the call as disproportionate, if not extreme, because they argue reforms of bioethics are frequently advanced now and will continue to be advanced and even increasingly advanced in the future. Furthermore, they regard the call as uncollegial and unprofessional because they claim it constitutes an inappropriately adversarial expression of one's convictions, an attack on nice people in their work, and a violation of professional norms amongst colleagues. I want to talk back to and even undermine these judgments, according to which philosophers should ignore or explicitly dismiss my call for the abolition of bioethics. In another context, I argued that the tacit profession-wide ableist contract to quash the sort of external critique of bioethics that my call for its abolition exemplifies is the most consequential, entrenched, and obfuscated scandal in philosophy with respect to academic freedom. In this context, I want to lend support to that argument. I do so by indicating how a genealogy of bioethics would expose the historical contingency and cultural specificity of bioethical styles of reasoning and regimes of truth that self-described bioethicists variously postulate as necessary, rational, objective, and universal, though paradoxically caring, compassionate, and concerned. As Foucault wrote, and I quote, "What different forms of rationality present as their necessary condition, one can perfectly well do the history of and recover the network of contingencies from which it has emerged, which does not mean, however, that these forms of rationality were irrational. It means that they rest on a base of human practice and of human history, and since these things have been made, they can, provided one knows how they were made, be unmade," end quote. With this recourse to history, Foucault showed that our forms of rationality depend on human practices that are neither necessary nor self-evident. By doing so, that is, Foucault opened cognitive and practical space to free us from a sense of fatalism, from the belief that our current practices and social arrangements are predestined. When we understand that bioethics reproduces a style of reasoning with a history, namely the diagnostic style of reasoning, as I've called it, that is, when we understand that bioethics is neither indispensable nor inevitable, but rather is a historically specific and contingent practice that functions in the service of power, then we can unmake it. Ian Hacking has asserted that styles of reasoning bring into being new sentences, new objects, new styles of evidence, new types of laws, new ways to be a candidate for true or false, and new types of possibilities. Given that bioethics advances the diagnostic style of reasoning, it brings into being new sentences, new candidates for true or false, and other novelties that fulfill the requirements of this style of reasoning. For, as Hacking argued, styles of reasoning are quote-unquote self-authenticating. That is, each style of reasoning is the historically and culturally specific canon of objectivity about the phenomena which the style itself brought into being as these types of things. Hacking, who repeatedly acknowledged his debt to Foucault, argued furthermore that there are neither sentences that are candidates for truth nor independently identified objects to be correct about prior to the development of a style of reasoning. Sentences of the relevant kinds are candidates for truth or falsehood only when a style of reasoning makes them so. The truth of a sentence of a kind introduced by a style of reasoning, Hacking wrote, is what we find out by reasoning using that style. Styles become standards of objectivity because they get at the truth, but a sentence of that kind is a candidate for truth or falsehood only in the context of that style. I rely on these insights from Hacking in order to argue that the new sentences, objects, laws, possibilities, and candidates for true or false that have emerged with the diagnostic style should be deconstructed and discarded to the degree demanded by a genealogical inquiry of their emergence and the role that they serve in the eugenic agenda of bioethics. Efforts to abolish the police and incarceration, too, are routinely discredited in the aforementioned ways. That is, calls for the abolition of policing and imprisonment are routinely characterized as unrealistic, idealistic, and disrespectful rebukes of authority, the law, and one's fellow members of society. Hence, abolitionists have responded to these sorts of dismissals. For example, Anna Terwell, drawing on the abolitionist work of Foucault, Davis, and others, responds to the charge that abolition of prisons is unrealistic and moralistic by considering both how criminal legal institutions actually function in practice and the limitations of reformist approaches to them, while taking seriously lived experiences of violence and informal responses to it, improvised by people with varying outcomes and perceptions of success. Terwell maintains that abolitionist thinking is, quote, attuned to the lived experiences of harm and violence while refusing to accept existing punitive practices as necessary, inevitable, or just, end quote. Abolitionist, Terwell writes, confront what prisons actually do and what they do not do, questioning their legitimacy. As Terwell puts it, and I quote at length, "We know that Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people are incarcerated at the highest rates, that incarceration inflicts suffering, shortens lifespans, ruptures family and social ties, and that it typically leads to reincarceration. Abolitionists find these realities intolerable, but theirs is not simply a moral critique that prisons are bad or evil. Importantly, their critique is political. Exactly who or what is served by the deployment of state violence and at what cost? What racial and economic hierarchies are upheld? What kinds of state power are legitimized? And what kinds of citizenship are affirmed and normalized?" End quote. My argument for the abolition of bioethics is likewise neither speculative nor unrealistic, but rather is political and materialist, elaborating a discussion that I introduced in my 2017 monograph on Foucault and feminist philosophy of disability to show how bioethics functions in non-ideal practice, how it animates and reproduces ableism within philosophy and beyond, how it detrimentally affects real disabled people, among others, that its end must therefore be imminent, and how we can think about disability otherwise. As Davis and co-authors state, it is crucial that we forge a critical space for what we have not yet been able to imagine. So the second subsection of the first section is entitled "Identifying the Biopolitics of Bioethics." The growing influence of bioethics and of bioethicists themselves is due to both the persistence of a cluster of beliefs according to which bioethics is a specialist knowledge that bioethicists are uniquely trained to apply, and to the naturalized conceptions of normality on which confidence in this cluster of belief depends. In particular, the bioethicist venerated training includes learning how to apply the allegedly universal principles of deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics to dilemmas and events that arise in current quote-unquote biomedical contexts, such as the extent to which genetic screening and other genetic technologies should be researched, developed, and subsequently employed. Thus, bioethicists presuppose that encounters deemed to be quote-unquote biomedical in nature provide them with distinct opportunities to express and apply extent values such as autonomy, well-being, and liberty. Nevertheless, when we acknowledge both the significance of Hacking's claims about the self-authenticating character of styles of reasoning and the import of Foucault's insight that the most efficient and successful forms of power are productive, we can recognize that this cluster of beliefs and the conceptions of normality on which it relies misconstrues the causal relation between bioethical discourse and the values that it is purported to merely apply. For the very articulation and purported application of these values through, say, the use of genetic technologies and the decision-making practices that surround them, contributes to the constitution and configuration of the values and to the delineation of biomedical ethics as the appropriate domain in which to apply them to all manner of predicaments, identities, states of affairs, and situations. In other words, the field of biomedical ethics actually produces the quote-unquote bioethical problems and issues that it is claimed to merely identify, ameliorate, and resolve. Within bioethics and philosophy in general, disability is predominantly conceived as a philosophically uninteresting and value-neutral biological trait that is, as a self-evidently natural and deleterious characteristic, difference, or property that some people embody or possess. On this individualized understanding of disability, disability is a prediscursive entity with transhistorical and transcultural properties that medicine and science can both astutely recognize and accurately represent, and to which universal principles can be applied. Thus, the subfield of bioethics has been naturalized as the appropriate philosophical sphere within which to consider disability. By drawing on Foucault, nevertheless, I have articulated a different understanding according to which the ontology of disability, the production of the ontological status of disability, and the supposed application of philosophical principles and theoretical frameworks to the phenomena of disability are performative and co-constitutive. In the terms of my understanding of disability, the ontological status of disability is always already a contingent political and hence value-laden state of affairs which should be historicized, relativized, and demedicalized. This understanding of disability politicizes the metaphysics of disability because it reconfigures disability as a product of power, specifically an apparatus of biopower, which Foucault identified as a relatively recent form of power that operates primarily through productive forms of coercion and control to maximize the conditions conducive to life, the life of the species, and the life of the individual. With biopolitics, that is, life is constituted as a problem and an object of government. The professional norms of bioethics induce bioethicists to comply with the apparatus of disability, and the neoliberal eugenics that impels it. Disability and feminist bioethics ethicists have, for example, seemed indifferent about the grievous arguments to promote MAID that Udo Schachlenk and other high-profile bioethicists articulate, or they demur about the academic freedom that entitles their bioethics colleagues to do so. As I detail in another context, for instance, some feminist bioethicists have repeatedly provided the leading exponent of MAID in Canada, feminist law professor Jocelyn Downing, with opportunities to publish her misrepresentations of MAID as the fulfillment of autonomy and individual choice enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In short, Udo Schachlenk, Downey, and their fellow feminist supporters have made obscure and thereby advance the successful normalization of neoliberal relations of power by and through the effective inculcation and utilization of a relatively recent kind of subjectivity, namely the self-determining and self-governing individual. What proponents of MAID refuse to acknowledge is the constitutive nature of force relations under neoliberal governmentality. Under liberal governmentality, that is, subjects are produced whose management and modification of their biological life through exercise of their supposedly prediscursive autonomy and freedom is fundamental to their notions of selfhood and responsible citizenship. As I've argued, these relations of power have already conspired to put in place the options from which one may autonomously choose. Indeed, the arguments of leading proponents of MAID rely on outmoded ideas about the self-originating character of the neoliberal subject's freedom and autonomy that are integral to this juridical conception of power. The autonomous, informed, and consenting individual, in whose name feminist arguments that promote MAID are advanced, is a historically and culturally specific artifact of discourse rather than a prediscursive being or self endowed with intrinsic liberties and freedoms. Two examples of recent genealogical work illustrate how the genealogical approach to philosophical and historical inquiry can expose political and ontological commitments that traditional philosophical and historical analyses do not. In colonial genealogies of national self-determination, Torsten Mungi uses a genealogical approach to show that the seemingly progressive idea of self-determination has a sordid past. By drawing on the work of Adam Getachew, Radhika Mangia, and Mandita Sharma, Mungi points out how throughout the 20th century, the principle of self-determination was used as a means to justify and consolidate imperialism. On a national level, Mungi writes, aspects of the liberal notion of self-determination, especially with respect to population and immigration control and regulation emerged in response to white fears about the migration of certain racialized groups. As Murthy explains, the appeal to self-determination has promised a distinctly liberal justification for a right to exclude because it appears to be an expression of the foundational liberal idea that legitimate political authority derives from the people. This revelation about the notorious uses to which authorities have put the liberal idea of self-determination, notes Murthy, raises serious questions about the meaning and emancipatory force of the principle of self-determination itself. Second example, in Liddell McWhorter's genealogy of the violence and vicissitudes that the notion of personhood comprises, she demonstrates why the seemingly timeless and universal character of personhood, which the liberal principles of self-determination and autonomy presuppose, should also be contested. McWhorter underscores, for instance, how evidence indicates that Indigenous North Americans have not understood themselves as modern moral persons in the lineage of John Locke, to whom the notion of personhood is traditionally attributed. The most overwhelming evidence in this regard, McWhorter notes, comes from differences in practices of ownership and concepts of property. Writes McWhorter, and I quote, "As far as I'm able to discern, despite all the variations of culture, language, and religion that existed in North America in the first decades of English colonization, there were very few Aboriginal peoples there and then who would have believed that a quote-unquote Indian hunter who killed a deer made that carcass his personal property by way of having mixed his labor with it, or indeed by any way at all. Meat was not property, deer were not property, land was not property, individual human beings were not proprietors." End quote. Insofar as Indigenous people of Turtle Island, that is North America, have resisted European ideas about proprietorship, in particular, have resisted ideas of individual human beings as proprietors, they've also refused ideas of human beings owning themselves, that is, ideas of humans as autonomous, self-determining persons. Indeed, McWhorter notes that the refusal of North American Indigenous peoples to instantiate personhood, especially in resistance to colonial regimes of criminal justice and property in land, is ongoing. Attending to this resistance, she argues, quote, helps to highlight the fact that modern moral personhood is a product of Western Europe that arose and took hold under very particular historical, political, and economic conditions, end quote. Modern moral personhood, McWhorter points out, is not a universal state or fact about human beings, and there have always been good reasons to question and challenge it. One example of this resistance to colonial Western notions of personhood, autonomy, and self-ownership is the adamant opposition of many Indigenous leaders of communities in so-called Canada to legislation that supports and advances MAID. For these Indigenous leaders and their communities in which suicide is rampant due to intergenerational trauma and systemic racism, the increasing availability of quote-unquote medical assistance in dying is a new instrument of cultural genocide tantamount to their dispossession of language and land, as well as to the operation of residential schools where thousands of Indigenous children died of starvation and disease and endured physical and sexual abuse. In this regard, therefore, McWhorter's genealogy of personhood reveals the contingency and historical and cultural specificity of this concept and its cohort, as well as the contingency and cultural and historical specificity of the esteem attributed to these conceptual objects. As McWhorter states, and I quote, "There have always been alternatives to moral personhood for self-aware human beings and communities, even if we modern moral persons today cannot quite imagine now what those alternatives were or might yet be, end quote. Indeed, let me point out that disabled advocates of state-sanctioned suicide who draw on a version of Foucault to support their claims fail to appreciate Foucault's unfortunate inconsistencies and misconstruals on the matter of self-imposed death, as Ian Marsh refers to it. For example, they do not apprehend the inconsistencies between remarks that he makes in favor of self-imposed death and his more comprehensive understanding of the complicated relationship between power and the constitution of the subject. On this more comprehensive understanding, the subject is enabled to act in order to be constrained, and kinds of subjects, such as the suicidal subject, come into being in accordance with the descriptions available to them under which they may act. Under liberal governmentality, that is, autonomy has emerged as an instrument of power rather than a principle of resistance to it or its adversary. In short, autonomy under liberal governmentality is a trap. The autonomous subject of bioethics, which, as I've argued, is first and foremost a liberal discourse, is thoroughly within the grip of power. As Foucault himself repeatedly argued, the most effective exercise of contemporary power relations consists in guiding the possible conduct of free and autonomous subjects and influencing the outcomes of their actions by putting in place the possible outcomes of action from which they may choose. That is, relations of governmentality enable subjects to act in ways that also constrain them by influencing, shaping, and limiting their actions in accordance with the capacity to choose from a highly circumscribed set of possible actions. By virtue of their subjection to governmental force relations, subjects, including suicidal subjects, are in effect formed, defined, and reproduced in accordance with what these relations of power require. So that's the first section, excerpts of the first section of the paper. Thank you for listening. So I will, for the last 4 minutes that we have for the session, I will take a question or two, or we can end there. I see that Dr. Brown has put a comment that says, in the chat, that says, prisons and gender exacerbate and maintain state and social violence rooted in eugenics and ableism. I thoroughly agree. Who is that author you quoted on self-determination? Are you, Torsten Menke. I can write that in the chat. It's a relatively recent paper. And I don't have the title of the, I gave the title in the paper. It should be fairly easy to find that paper. I found it fairly easy, and I don't have institutional access to journals, so you should be able to get it online fairly easily. Again, the title is Colonial Genealogies of National Self-Determination. Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, besides who the author of that paper was, I'm quite willing to. Maybe I'll just say so. I said that my paper was going to appear in a special issue of Feminist Philosophy Quarterly that I'm guest editing. That Hopefully that issue is going to come out before the end of the year in time to be a commemorative issue of Foucault's birth in 1926. Oh, I see. Okay, so I'm being told that there's now a question. There's a question from Virgil Murthy. Can you talk about the relationship of the BSM to, can you talk about the relationship of the BSM to the anti-disability politics and bioethics epitomized by Maid? Can I talk about the relationship of, um, well, I have, well, first of
So
all,
I can be a little bit like I just wanted to get it in case you ended the session too early, but to be a little bit less confusing and more specific. I just meant, can you describe the relationship between liberal discourse of disability that are, disability advocacy in line with the BSM and like reformist bioethics interventions? And like, and just generally, do you think that there is any prognosis that's positive, or are you cynical about uh, social model oriented disability activism?
well, first of all, I'm interested in the way that you have described the British social model. I take that's what you mean by the BSM. That's the acronym that I use. So the BSM is mostly historically associated with a historical materialist or Marxist uh, approach. So it's interesting that you would associate it with liberalism. Um, I wouldn't. But then I know some of the Marxists who sort of initiated it. Can you talk about well, I mean, as you know, Virgil and maybe some others here, I'm very critical of the BSM, and I've critiqued it in a number of papers for um, over 20 years. The first being the first significant publication being on the government of disability, which it was published in Social Theory and Practice in 2001. Um, but I do want to say something about the disabled people's movement in the UK, which follows the BSM, the British social model, has historically been quite critical of bioethics, and has issued public statements and to demonstrate this. I think that you can also find this opposition between bioethics and the disability rights movement, as it's called in the United States, or even disability rights in Canada and elsewhere around internationally. So there has been a sort of uh, um, there has been globally a critique of bioethics, and some disabled philosophers who identify themselves as bioethics have who identify themselves as bioethicists have sort of argued for the reform of bioethics, have sort of acknowledged those critiques, but offer reformist approaches to bioethics, which I try to dismantle. In any case, I think that we're over time now, and so I want to close the session for a 5-minute break, and we'll come back at about. Well, we're supposed to come back at 12:10, but whatever. So. Um, uh, So take your break, go to the bathroom, just, fix your hair or, pat your dog or whatever, and we'll see you soon.